It was a regular afternoon when 15-year-old Alex was walking home from school, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He was heading down a familiar street, the one he had walked every day for years. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, and the hum of distant cars was the only sound in the air. It was peaceful, almost soothing. Alex had just finished a tough math test, and he was thinking about how he would spend the evening. Maybe play some basketball with friends, or watch his favorite show on TV. As he turned the corner near his house, something unusual happened. Two police officers, standing by a patrol car, suddenly called out to him. Alex, a bit confused but not worried, stopped and turned toward them. The officers didn't give him a friendly greeting. Instead, one of them, a middle-aged man with a stern face, stared at him suspiciously. The other officer, a woman in her early 30s, joined in with a cold expression. "Where are you going?" the man asked, his voice sharp. Alex was taken aback by the question. He hadn't done anything wrong. He looked at the officers, unsure of why they had singled him out. "I'm just heading home from school," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. The officer didn't seem convinced. "Where exactly is home?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked Alex up and down. Alex explained, "I live just a few blocks down. Right there." He pointed towards his house, which was only a short walk away. It wasn't unusual for him to walk alone, and he knew the neighborhood well. But the officers didn't seem to be listening. Instead, they exchanged a glance, their faces filled with suspicion. "Are you sure about that?" the woman officer asked, stepping closer. Her voice was stern, and Alex could feel his pulse quicken. He didn't understand why they were treating him this way. "I'm telling you, I live here," Alex replied, trying to remain patient. But he could feel something in the air, something uncomfortable, like a storm brewing. The officers didn't believe him. The man's eyes remained fixed on Alex, almost as if he were trying to figure out if he was lying. The woman officer then began to ask him a few more questions, ones Alex found odd, like what school he attended and what classes he was in. The more he answered, the more they seemed to doubt him. For a moment, Alex began to wonder if he had said something wrong. His mind raced as he tried to think of any reason why they might be questioning him so intensely. He had never had any problems with the police before, so why was this happening now? But despite his honest answers, the officers' questions became more demanding. They asked to see his ID, which Alex didn't have with him since he was just a kid walking home from school. The frustration in their voices grew. They were treating him like a suspect, and he couldn't understand why. At that moment, something in Alex shifted. He realized that this wasn't just an ordinary stop. There was something more going on. He could feel the tension building between them, and it made him uneasy. But instead of panicking, he stayed calm, even as the officer's behavior grew more aggressive. Little did he know, the situation was about to take a drastic turn, and everything he thought he knew about this encounter was about to change. The situation was starting to feel more uncomfortable with every passing moment. Alex stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. The officers weren't backing down. They continued to press him with more and more questions, each one seeming more personal than the last. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the anxiety was creeping in. Why were they treating him this way? The officer who had first stopped him, a tall man with a firm jaw, was now leaning in closer, examining Alex's face like he was looking for something. "You don't look like you belong around here," the officer said with a frown. Alex was taken aback by the comment. What did that even mean? He had lived in this neighborhood his whole life. Alex felt his frustration beginning to rise, but he didn't want to argue. He knew that would only make things worse. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how to get out of this strange situation. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't broken any laws. But the more he tried to explain, the more the officers seemed convinced that something was off. The woman officer, still standing by, crossed her arms and gave Alex a suspicious look. "Do you have any idea why we're stopping you?" she asked, her tone sharper than before. Alex shook his head. "No, I don't," he said honestly. "I'm just walking home from school." The man officer clicked his tongue and stepped back. "That's the thing," he said, pacing slightly. "You don't look like you're just walking home." His voice had a touch of accusation, and Alex couldn't help but feel a rising sense of panic. Was it because of the way he looked? Or his age? Or maybe even the neighborhood he was walking through? "Where's your school then?" the officer asked, his arms folded across his chest now, still skeptical. Alex pointed down the street, towards the direction of his school. "It's just over there, a few blocks away," he said, hoping they would let him go after that. But instead, the officer glanced at his partner, and they exchanged a knowing look, as if something about Alex's story didn't add up. The woman officer stepped forward. "You know," she said slowly, "it's strange that a kid like you would be out here alone at this time of day. People like you don't usually walk around this area." Alex's stomach dropped. It was clear now. They were assuming something about him because of the way he looked, because of his skin color. The weight of their words hung in the air, and Alex suddenly felt like he wasn't seen as just a kid. He was something else to them, something less. The unfairness of it all started to settle deep in his chest. The officers didn't seem to notice his growing discomfort. Instead, they kept on with their questions, pushing him further and further into a corner. Alex's mind began to race. Why weren't they listening? Why were they treating him like this? For a moment, he thought about turning around and walking away, but he knew that could make things worse. So instead, he stood there, hoping that something, anything, would change. But the officers weren't done. They insisted on checking his ID. Alex hadn't thought he needed it. After all, he was just walking home. But now, without it, they seemed even more certain that he was hiding something. As the seconds ticked by, Alex felt the weight of the situation pressing on him more and more. The tension was thick enough to cut through. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. And he had no idea what was going to happen next. The situation was beginning to feel more like a nightmare than anything else. Alex stood frozen, feeling the tension building with every passing second. The officers seemed determined to find something wrong, something to justify why they were still holding him there on the street. His heart raced as the woman officer continued to stare at him with suspicion, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Listen," Alex said, trying to remain calm. "I didn't do anything. I'm just walking home, and you have no reason to stop me." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear building up inside him. He knew he was right, but the way the officers were acting made him feel small, as if his words didn't matter at all. The man officer looked at him with a hard stare, his eyes cold and unrelenting. "We're just trying to make sure everything is in order. But the truth is, you don't look like you belong here." His words were harsh, and Alex's stomach sank. What did that even mean? Alex glanced around, hoping that someone would intervene. The street, usually filled with people, now felt empty. No one was paying attention, and the few passers-by just walked quickly, avoiding eye contact as if they didn't want to get involved. Alex suddenly felt very alone, isolated in the middle of a situation that didn't make any sense. "I don't know what you're talking about," Alex said, trying to stand his ground. He was doing his best to keep his voice steady, but his hands were shaking slightly at his sides. He couldn't understand why they were making such a big deal out of something so simple. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't causing any trouble. But the officers didn't seem to hear him. Instead, they continued with their questioning. The man officer asked him where he went to school again. Then he asked if Alex had any other identification, like a student ID, even though he had already mentioned that he didn't carry it with him. The whole situation was becoming more confusing by the second, and Alex didn't know how to make it stop. "I told you," Alex repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just going home." The officers exchanged a look. For a moment, it felt like they were deciding what to do next. But instead of letting him go, they made a decision that made Alex's chest tighten with fear. Without another word, the man officer pulled out his handcuffs and moved toward Alex. "Hey, what are you doing?" Alex shouted, taking a step back. His heart was pounding now, and his mind was racing. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here they were, about to arrest him for something he couldn't understand. "We're taking you in for questioning," the officer said firmly, his voice low and serious. The woman officer moved to Alex's other side, and before he could protest again, she grabbed his arm, pulling it behind his back. The cold, hard metal of the cuffs clicked into place, and Alex's heart sank. He tried to twist his arm out of her grip, but it was no use. He had no choice but to comply, even though every fiber of his being screamed that this wasn't right. As they pushed him toward the police car, Alex felt the eyes of the street, the eyes of the world, on him. But no one stepped forward. No one tried to help. He was just another kid being dragged into something he didn't understand, with no way to stop it. His mind raced with confusion and fear. What would happen now? Would his parents be able to help? Would anyone believe him when they found out the truth? But for now, it didn't matter. All he could do was try to stay calm as they shoved him into the back of the police car, the doors slamming shut with a finality that made his chest tighten. As the police cars sped down the street, Alex sat silently in the back seat, his mind racing. His arms were still aching from where the handcuffs had dug into his skin, and the cold metal of the cuffs felt like a constant reminder that everything had gone horribly wrong. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. How had it come to this? He had done nothing wrong. All he had wanted was to get home from school, just like any other day. But instead, he was sitting in the back of a police car, completely confused and scared. The officer sitting next to the driver didn't say a word. The woman officer, who had been the more silent one earlier, just stared ahead, her expression blank and unreadable. It seemed like neither of them cared about what was happening to him. To them, he was just another person they had to deal with, another routine stop, another story they wouldn't bother to understand. But Alex wasn't just another story. He was a person, a regular teenager with hopes, dreams, and a family who loved him. And as the car turned down another street, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just going to let this happen without at least trying to do something. He had to get out of this situation. He had to try to explain, try to make them see that he wasn't who they thought he was. But how? His mind was blank. There was nothing he could say that would change their minds. They had already decided who he was based on nothing but their assumptions. For a few minutes, Alex just sat there, his head against the window, watching the city go by in a blur. The familiar sights of the neighborhood now felt distant and foreign. He had been taken away from everything he knew in an instant, and no matter how much he tried to make sense of it, he couldn't. But then, just as Alex was beginning to give in to the hopelessness that threatened to swallow him, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a small moment of normalcy in the sea of confusion. He hesitated at first, but then he reached into his pocket and pulled it out, only to realize that his hands were still bound by the handcuffs. "Can you unlock these?" Alex asked the officer next to him, his voice shaky but determined. The officer didn't even look at him. "You'll be fine," the officer said, barely acknowledging his request. "Just hold tight." But Alex wasn't going to hold tight. He wasn't going to sit quietly and let this all play out. This wasn't right. He was not a criminal, and he wasn't going to let anyone treat him like one. The buzz from his phone grew louder in his pocket, and Alex knew who it was. It had to be his dad. His father, the one person who could get him out of this mess, the one person who would know what to do. Alex could feel his pulse quicken as he managed to get the phone out of his pocket. He unlocked it with his thumb and quickly dialed his father's number. The officer sitting next to him glanced over but didn't stop him. Maybe they didn't think he would actually make the call. The phone rang for what felt like forever, each ring a little louder in the silence of the car. Alex's anxiety grew with every second. But then, finally, his father picked up. Alex didn't wait for a greeting. He just blurted out everything. "Dad, I've been arrested. The cops stopped me on my way home, and now they're taking me somewhere. They won't listen to me, Dad. You have to help." There was a brief pause on the other end. For a moment, Alex wasn't sure if his father was even there. But then he heard his father's voice, calm and steady, cutting through the panic that had filled his chest. "Don't worry, Alex," his dad said, his voice low but firm. "I'll handle it. Just stay calm. I'll be there as soon as I can." Alex felt a sense of relief wash over him. His dad was coming. He wasn't alone in this. For the first time since everything had gone wrong, Alex felt like there was a chance things might be okay. But even though he felt some comfort, he still had no idea what the officers were going to do next, or how long it would take for his dad to get there. All he could do was wait and hope. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Alex sat in the back of the police car, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into his chest. His mind was spinning, but now, at least, there was a small glimmer of hope. His dad was on his way. Alex knew his father's reputation, and he knew that when his dad got involved, things had a way of changing fast. But even knowing that, the uncertainty still hung over him. What would happen when his father arrived? Would the officers apologize? Would they let him go? Or would they continue to treat him like a suspect? The longer he waited, the more questions swirled in Alex's mind. The streetlights passed by in a blur, the car's engine humming steadily as the officer drove in silence. Every now and then, Alex could hear the soft murmur of the officers' conversation, but it wasn't about him. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices low, like they were discussing something far removed from his current predicament. He was starting to feel like an invisible presence in the back seat, a person who no longer mattered to them, just a body to be moved along. Minutes seemed to drag on forever. Alex leaned against the cold window, looking out at the unfamiliar streets, and he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, locked in the back of a police car, with no clear explanation as to why. His stomach twisted with frustration. Why were they doing this to him? What was going through their minds? But then a sudden shift occurred. The phone buzzed in his pocket again, interrupting his thoughts. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, and now it was here. It was his father, calling back. "Dad!" Alex exclaimed, his voice shaky but filled with relief. "Dad, are you close? They'd got me in the back of the car, and I don't know where they're taking me. You've got to help me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Alex feared that something had gone wrong. But then his father's calm voice filled the silence. "Alex, listen to me carefully," his dad said, his tone firm and reassuring. "I need you to stay calm. I'm already on my way to the station. Everything's going to be okay, but I need you to hold it together for just a little longer. Do you understand?" Alex's chest tightened with emotion, but he nodded, even though his dad couldn't see him. "Yeah, I understand," he replied quietly. His father's voice softened a little. "Good. Just stay put. Don't try anything. Don't say anything more to them unless you need to. I'll handle it when I get there." The reassurance in his father's words gave Alex a sense of calm he hadn't realized he needed. He could feel his panic begin to fade, replaced by the understanding that someone who truly cared for him was on his way. For a brief moment, Alex allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe deeply. His father would fix this. His father always knew what to do. The officers in the front of the car seemed oblivious to the conversation happening in the back. They continued to drive, their attention fixed on the road ahead. unaware of how Alex's father was preparing to turn the tide in his son's favor. Alex thought about what his dad might say when he arrived. His dad had a way of talking to people, a way of commanding respect without saying too much. He would make them understand that this wasn't just about an arrest. It was about what was right and wrong. Alex glanced out of the window again, trying to keep his nerves under control. He was scared, but he knew his father was the one person who could set everything right. The police car continued its path, and Alex sat quietly, holding on to the hope that the next part of this ordeal would soon be over. The car slowed to a stop in front of the local police station. Alex could feel his stomach knotting up again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a mix of anticipation, anxiety, and relief. His father was close. He had to be. Alex could practically hear his footsteps, firm and steady, as he made his way to the station. Everything that had happened, the questioning, the handcuffs, the fear had been building to this moment. The officers hadn't said a word during the drive, and the silence was almost suffocating. When the officer in the front seat opened the door and got out, Alex was left in the quiet of the car. He could feel the eyes of the city on him as he sat there alone, the clock ticking by, each second feeling longer than the last. The only sound was the distant hum of cars, the occasional footsteps of passing pedestrians, and the soft tapping of his fingers on the metal seat. Alex glanced at the officer who remained in the car. The woman officer, still seated next to him, didn't seem to care about his presence anymore. She wasn't even looking at him. Her attention was fixed elsewhere, her face expressionless. Alex felt a growing frustration bubbling inside him. What did they expect from him? What did they think he had done? He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, waiting for a resolution that seemed so far away. Minutes passed, and Alex's hopes started to flicker again. Where was his father? Why hadn't he arrived yet? He tried to push those thoughts out of his head, reminding himself that his father would come through. His dad always did. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door opened again. Alex's heart skipped a beat as he looked up, his eyes immediately locking on the familiar figure standing in the doorway. It was his father. He was here. Alex's dad walked toward the car with a calm confidence, his eyes scanning the scene as he approached. He didn't look angry, but there was something else there, a quiet authority, a certain understanding that came from years of experience. His father had dealt with situations like this before, and Alex knew that this moment would be no different. The woman officer, who had been silently waiting, looked up as Alex's father stepped closer. There was a shift in the air, a noticeable tension that seemed to settle over the whole situation. For the first time, the officer's posture changed. She straightened up, a small sign of respect as Alex's father approached. "Is there a problem here?" his dad asked, his voice calm but with an edge of authority that made it clear he wasn't here for games. The officer hesitated before responding, unsure of how to explain the situation. Alex's father didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he took a step forward and looked directly at the officer who had arrested Alex. "My son is not a criminal," he said, his words firm but measured. "He deserves to be treated with respect." The officer's expression faltered for a moment. Alex could see the uncertainty in his face, the realization that they had made a mistake. For a second, the officer didn't know how to respond. Alex's father didn't give him time to think, though. He took out his phone, quickly making a call to someone higher up in the department. His father's reputation alone had a way of making people listen, and within seconds, the tone of the situation changed. The officers, who had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, now stood a little straighter, unsure of how to handle the situation. The man officer, who had been the one to first question Alex, now seemed uncomfortable, his eyes shifting nervously. It was clear. The power had shifted. The officers had no choice but to listen. And Alex, still sitting in the back of the car, felt a mix of relief and anger. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. No one should have to go through this. No one should have to feel like a suspect for no reason at all. But now, at least, things were starting to turn in the right direction. His father finished the call, looking over at Alex with a reassuring smile. "It's going to be all right," he said, his voice steady and sure. And for the first time that day, Alex felt like he could breathe again. The air in the police station seemed to have shifted. What had started as a tense and frightening experience for Alex was now on the verge of resolution. As his father made his way toward the officer's desk, Alex sat quietly in the corner, watching the scene unfold. His father's calm yet firm presence had already made a difference, but Alex couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved to see his dad here, but on the other, the anger he had felt earlier still simmered beneath the surface. Why had this even happened in the first place? His father approached the officer who had originally stopped Alex, and for a moment, the officer looked uncomfortable. The man straightened up as his dad drew nearer, and Alex could see the change in his demeanor. The officer seemed to be on edge now, his confidence replaced by hesitation. His father didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "Why was my son detained?" he asked, his voice calm but unmistakably authoritative. The officer shifted uncomfortably, looking from Alex to his father. He knew that things were about to take a turn for the worse for him. "We were just doing our job, sir," he replied, but his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. "We had reason to believe." "That's not good enough," Alex's father interrupted, his tone sharp but not angry. "You don't just stop someone because of how they look. You don't make assumptions without evidence. You need to understand that your actions have consequences." The officer shifted his weight, unsure of how to respond. He had likely been trained to handle situations like this, but this was different. The man standing in front of him wasn't just any father. He was someone with power, someone who had the means to make things happen. Alex's dad continued. "This is a lesson for you," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Every person deserves to be treated with dignity. You don't get to make judgments based on appearances, and you certainly don't get to treat someone like a criminal when they've done nothing wrong. My son is not a suspect. He's a teenager walking home from school. That's it." The officer nodded slightly, clearly uncomfortable. Alex could tell that the weight of his father's words was sinking in. The man hadn't expected this level of scrutiny, and for the first time in the conversation, he seemed to doubt his own actions. His father was right. They had made a mistake. Meanwhile, Alex was still sitting quietly, absorbing everything his father was saying. He wanted to say something, to shout out how unfair it had been, but he knew his father was handling the situation. His dad was taking control, and that gave Alex a sense of peace he hadn't felt all day. After a few moments, the officer looked over at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them. The woman officer, who had been mostly silent throughout, now spoke up, her tone softer than it had been earlier. "We didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it once had. Alex's father didn't let up. "You need to understand that this kind of behavior has consequences," he repeated. "People are watching. And the next time someone like my son gets stopped, you'd better think twice before you make assumptions." The room was quiet now, the tension palpable. The officer seemed to realize that his actions were being closely examined, and that made him uncomfortable. He had thought that this was just another routine stop, but now, with Alex's father standing in front of him, it felt like the whole situation had been put under a microscope. Finally, Alex's father turned to him and gave him a reassuring smile. "Let's go home, son," he said, his voice warm and gentle now. It was a simple phrase, but it meant everything to Alex in that moment. As they walked out of the station together, Alex felt the weight of the last few hours start to lift. It had been a long, confusing, and frightening ordeal, but his father's support had made all the difference. The officers had made their mistake, but now it was time for them to learn from it. And for Alex, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the only way to correct an injustice is to stand up for yourself, to hold your ground, and to make sure your voice is heard. With his dad by his side, Alex knew that no matter what happened next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. The next few days after the incident felt like a whirlwind for Alex. He was back in school, but things weren't quite the same. The whole experience weighed heavily on his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He had always known that life wasn't always fair, but being treated the way he was by the officers made it feel more real than ever. Yet, as the days passed, he realized something important. He wasn't alone in this. His father had made sure that the officers understood their mistake, but he also made sure that no one forgot what had happened. The news of the incident spread quickly, and soon there were stories about it in the local papers. The police officers involved were placed under scrutiny, and an internal review was launched. Alex's father had used his connections to make sure that this wasn't swept under the rug. But for Alex, the real victory came from the way his father had handled the situation, not with anger, but with calm authority and a strong sense of justice. It didn't take long for the officers to realize how serious the matter was. They were called into meetings with their supervisors and had to explain their actions. The department issued an official statement, apologizing for the mistake, but Alex knew that the apology was just the beginning. They would have to do more than say sorry. The officers would have to prove that they had learned from their actions and that they would never treat someone the way they had treated him. Alex's family received messages of support from their community, many of them thanking his father for standing up to the officers. But despite the gratitude, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that things had only changed on the surface. The incident made him wonder how many other people had experienced the same kind of treatment without anyone ever stepping in to help them. How many people had been judged before they were even given a chance? The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that there was still much to be done to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. One afternoon, Alex's father sat him down for a talk. They were in the living room, the same place where they had shared so many conversations before. This time, though, the conversation felt different. His father looked at him with a serious expression, but there was warmth in his eyes. "You handled yourself well," his dad said, his voice calm and encouraging. "I'm proud of you, Alex. But there's more to this than just what happened to you. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what you did." Alex listened carefully. His father wasn't just talking about the mistake the officers had made. He was talking about something bigger. His dad wanted him to understand that change didn't come just from one event. It came from a commitment to always stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. "I want you to remember this, son," his father continued. "This world can be unfair at times, but that doesn't mean you stay silent when you see something wrong. You speak up. You make sure people hear your voice." Alex nodded. It was a simple message, but it carried a lot of weight. He had always admired his father, but now he felt even more respect for the way his dad had handled the whole situation. He didn't just talk about justice, he lived it. Over time, things started to return to normal for Alex, but the lessons from the experience stayed with him. He became more aware of the challenges that people faced every day, and he realized that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. He began to speak out more, not just when it came to his own experiences, but when he saw others treated unfairly as well. The incident with the police had taught him something he would never forget: the power of standing up for yourself and for others, no matter the circumstances. And most importantly, he understood that no matter what life threw his way, he wasn't alone. His father had taught him that. The story of what happened that day didn't just end with the officers being held accountable. It became a turning point in Alex's life. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was up to him, and to everyone who stood up against injustice, to make sure that one day, no one would have to face what he did.